You don't see a thing creeping in on the edge there? Okay, good.
Nope. Nope.
Okay. Good to see you. Sorry for all that went down last week. We're recording locally now, so we have a backup, I presume.
Yes, I'm recording locally, and I'm about to go. I am.
Okay. Yeah, we're looking
Trust
forward to
me.
it. And I can go until 11:20.
Okay, perfect. So let me.
So let's take a little more time than last time, as long as we have.
Yeah, you got it.
We could talk about Bernie too, and where the movement's at.
Okay, so I'm going live. This is going to go live immediately on YouTube. Hopefully, we don't have the same problem as last time. And thank you again. So I'm so sorry that we have to do this.
It's not your fault, and I'm glad for the opportunity to reconnect.
Yeah, I had no idea that it would be so soon.
Well, and it does speak to so many issues. I mean, just the experience that you and I shared this week in terms of we were silenced effectively, and these are issues that I had a chance to address as an advocate before running for Congress, and I did not anticipate that as running for Congress that I would become the target of, or not the target, or at least the
unintended or unintentional.
Right. I've made this point that I don't think it's by avarice necessarily that YouTube took the video down. I think it's just by algorithm, but that's exactly the point, that algorithmic decision-making leads to bad decisions that were erroneous, that when people look at them, they're like, oh no, this was a bad idea. And when you silence congressional candidates who are running on civil liberties issues embedded in our Constitution that are vitally threatened, that the mainstream corporate press refuses to cover, and those are the things that get taken down, it's not just my voice that's placed at risk. I dare say it is our democracy, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic saying.
No, it's no problem. Now it's having trouble starting a live stream. This is so weird. But don't worry, we are recording. So anything, it will all work out in the end. Hopefully, I just want to see if this goes through to YouTube. If not, we'll just continue as usual. And I'll just upload it later. Come on. Why are you gonna get stuck on that last little sliver of loading bar? Oh well. So I think the best thing to do would just be to start. So I want to thank everybody for watching this. This is round 2 of my interview with Shahid Buttar, who's running against Nancy Pelosi, who is in her 17th 2-term run now as a House representative. But before we get to any of that, I would like to talk a little bit about your work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit dedicated to digital privacy, free speech, and innovation online. And Shahid, while you were there, you worked on the Santa Clara Principles for Content Moderation. And for those who don't know, those are basically minimum guidelines. A bunch of organizations got together to write minimum guidelines for transparency and how big tech platforms, their efforts to take down user-generated content or suspend users that violate their rules. So it's like the standards that they would have to apply or recommended that they apply. Now, as a congressional candidate, you watched as your content effectively was taken down. What was that like from the outside? Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like on the inside, working on the guidelines? And I'll just let you go.
My time at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, it was near and dear to my heart. I love the organization very much, and the issues that we worked on around content moderation, I never suspected that they would become as personal to me and for you as they have become this week. I'll particularly shout out my colleagues, my former colleagues, because I'm no longer at EFF. I left the organization to focus on my campaign. But my colleagues there who work on content moderation more focused, they were the ones who particularly developed the Santa Clara Principles. I helped promote them and spread them around. My particular focus at EFF was much more on government surveillance and to some extent net neutrality. But the Santa Clara Principles brought into sharp focus at the time the complete and utter arbitrariness of corporate content moderation. And we all know now that we live in a world where speech is effectively mediated by large corporate tech platforms. What I don't think people necessarily recognize is that there is no Wizard of Oz. It's not like there's anyone at YouTube who decided earlier this week that you were in my conversation about how the Trump administration was weaponizing this pandemic to propose authoritarian detention powers, overriding habeas corpus and threatening the right to trial, effectively importing into the United States the key principle, the legal principle at work in Guantanamo Bay. You know, an issue that only Newsweek and Politico have written stories about, one each, and those were weeks ago. And it was interesting, I reread one of them recently, and Politico wrote about this as a letter from Attorney General Barr to Congress, requesting basically these emergency detention powers. And there's been reporting in the press unrelated to that proposal about how even civil liberties advocates who've been very outspoken about government surveillance and its arbitrariness and threat to democracy have been willing to consider relatively authoritarian measures adopted in the name of responding to a pandemic. And of course, the whole point of these conversations that we've been trying to have for 20 years, because there still hasn't been a transparent debate about government surveillance, even since the passage of the Patriot Act, which Nancy Pelosi continues trying to extend, even after several of its most controversial powers have finally already expired as scheduled. The conversation we never have had is about transparency, oversight, use, abuse. How do you contain these powers? No one says that we can't spy on bad guys. What we say is, if you're going to do that, you have to at least abide by some restrictions and respect people's rights, especially recognizing our nation's history, which is not glowing in this dimension, despite our rhetorical commitments of free speech in the First Amendment. And we could talk about the history of government suppression and how these kinds of powers have been abused before. Detention powers are even more potentially authoritarian than surveillance powers. And it's not just any administration we're talking about handing them to. We're talking about a criminal administration that knows no respect for human rights, abroad or at home, right?
Right, so I just want to bring,
yeah, sorry, thank you.
No problem. I just want to bring this back a little bit to the private sector and large platforms and their practices and how they moderate content, because I feel like in the last few years there has been a push for greater content moderation on sites like Facebook, sites like Twitter and YouTube, in light of Russia's election interference in 2016.
Right.
And some of that has resulted in algorithmic safeguards put in place that you and I just sort of ran into on Monday. But it's not the first time I've run into the algorithm problems on Facebook, posting about Yemen, doing reporting on Yemen. I ran into that as well. And so I was wondering what you feel the role of Congress is, if there is any role at all, to play in enforcing transparency on digital platforms by social media companies.
Absolutely. We make thresholds and distinctions in the law in other places between large companies and small ones, large ones whose decisions have public externalities. There's a whole body of law. Antitrust law is predicated on the notion that seemingly private behavior can have public impacts. That very same recognition should apply both through antitrust law to the companies, which is entirely under-enforced and not applied, but also I think through a statutory regime that recognizes the way that the constitutional values are at stake here, namely free speech principles enshrined in our First Amendment, cannot survive arbitrary, corporate, private content moderation. It's private, so it doesn't reach the level of state action, so it doesn't violate traditional First Amendment principles. So it will take an act of Congress to essentially recognize the public good and the public interest in content moderation by major corporate tech platforms. Now we can differentiate and preserve innovation by leaving small platforms, startups, subject to a looser set of rules so that there's space to innovate. But when platforms grow to a certain size, like Facebook, where they can drive democracies into a ditch, we have to be able to stop that from happening. And that requires public accountability. We've seen none of that. Mark Zuckerberg appeared before Congress in the last session, and Congress revealed its utter and frankly embarrassing incapacity to ask him even any thing of intelligent questions. I mean, it was like a master class in the ignorance of Congress. And why do we have people making public policy decisions who have to ask the most basic, pedantic, frankly, silly questions? They can go to any 15-year-old in their districts and just have the questions that they were asking him answer, right? I mean, wasting these opportunities to hold accountable titans of industry who are running roughshod, not just, and this is the point, over your rights as a journalist or my rights as a speaker, and particularly as a candidate for public office, but the collective right that our democracy shares in being able to access information. And it's really, I want to get sharp here with respect to YouTube and Google. And with all respect, we have a lot of supporters who work for those companies. We certainly have a lot of supporters who use those companies' services and products. But I'll put it this way: Google, one reason Google attained its size was a motto about not being evil. And the company embedded in its ethos and its practice was the expansion of transparency. And a lot of things recently run very counter to those public declarations, those commitments, particularly transparency. There's nothing transparent about taking down independent journalism, covering threats to the right to trial and habeas corpus, particularly in the time of a pandemic when the corporate media isn't paying attention. That doesn't advance transparency. It doesn't serve a public good either. It's opaque and it's democracy destroying. And companies need to, I think internally there are voices of dissent, which Google, unfortunately, recently, I think has generally tried to squelch in the wake of employee activism, challenging the corporate decisions around, for instance, at one point the company was selling its services to the Pentagon to improve its artificial intelligence.
I was going to say, I think they dropped the "don't be evil" part from there. Yeah. I'm
just raising the idea that, these corporate platforms are not benevolent, and we certainly can't trust them. And it's not to say, I'm not accusing anybody at YouTube of avarice or, being a political hack and taking down what we were saying because it threatens the establishment or the democratic corporate center leadership, which defers to these kinds of authoritarian powers. That's not my claim. I mean, the democratic centrist leadership does defer to those authoritarian powers, but I'm not saying anyone at YouTube is intentionally trying to silence us.
Right.
It's the danger of letting computers drive decisions with constitutional significance, just like we shouldn't be letting computers decide how long people go to jail or, what bail they have to post. The fact that they have to, cash bail in itself is an atrocity. But if we're going to concede that it's going to exist, why do we let computers decide how much money somebody has to pay to have the right to go home while they wait for their right to trial?
So let me ask you then, do you, and you and I have talked about this before, and I think this is an area where we might not necessarily agree, but do you think there's a case that when a platform gets to a certain size, then it becomes a public square, that social media platforms are the new public square?
That would ultimately be a jurisprudential decision. I don't think that's up to Congress to decide. Because when we talk about public square, we're invoking First Amendment terms. And so, Congress could legislate around that issue, but the only reason that the term has significance is in constitutional jurisprudence, so the court can pull the leg out of that stool at any point. So I think ultimately what you're getting at is a constitutional question. And I think the constitutional questions are resolved not just by the court, but by we, the people of the United States. I've seen this happen before. Marriage equality, the Obergefell decision, was an example of the people of the United States forcing a constitutional decision on a conservative Supreme Court that recognized an expansion of civil and human rights. And I'm very proud to have been an early advocate for marriage equality 10 years before Nancy Pelosi even acknowledged the equal rights of my gay neighbors. And I'm proud particularly as a cis hetero Muslim person raised in the Midwest who have fought for intersectional civil rights at a time when they were not popular among Democrats. I've seen constitutional jurisprudence respond to that popular consensus. So I think that we are already forcing, the fact that we're having this dialogue reflects a rising public awareness of the need to establish corporate accountability for these kinds of content moderation decisions. I would rather do it through a statutory framework, frankly, because I don't trust the courts at this point in time. It's another reason why I've proposed to end judicial life tenure to protect judicial independence, introducing staggered 18-year terms for Supreme Court justices to recover the courts from a politicized era of right-wing co-optation. People are concerned about Justice Kavanaugh, for instance, an open rapist being on the court. I fought his nomination in 2006 to the DC circuit. I've watched the right wing take over the courts for the last generation. It's one reason why I'm running for Congress, because this idea of limiting life tenure could be one way to constrain the courts. The idea of expanding a public right to accountability to the corporations can proceed through other tracks. So one of those is antitrust law. I think it's certainly, there's a well-established alternative body in the law outside the public square doctrine that recognizes the need to preserve space for competition and fairness in the marketplace. Aside from that established body of law, I'd like to expand it to explicitly address political markets. And frankly, it would give another reason, another textual basis for courts to hold companies accountable for these sorts of content moderation and other decisions that hold constitutional significance, potentially democracy destroying decisions like taking down, an interview about civil liberties. There's another way, though, in terms of the expansion of antitrust statutes to address political markets, also helps us address another very pernicious issue in our body politic that the Supreme Court has recently thrown its hands in the air addressing, and that is partisan gerrymandering. Antitrust principles applied to political markets, if we had the Sherman Act just accept, as one particular case we can overturn allowing that application, the application of antitrust principles to gerrymandering would suggest that it's not just voters who are denied meaningful representation and choice when state legislators choose their constituents instead of letting their constituents choose them. It's also the democracies of our states that suffer as a result with predictable consequences. It's one reason why we're unfortunately subject to corporate rule. I know that I hit a lot of different things there.
Yeah, no, it's good though. It's I feel like this was a conversation that you and I between you and I, that it's been coming for a long time, but also especially in light of what happened on Monday. So I do want to shift gears now and talk about the thing that could get us taken down off of YouTube, apparently. So if we are live right now, and there's anybody watching and this gets cut off, don't worry, it is being recorded. The full video will be up. So I wanted to ask you about the pandemic that's sweeping the country and what you're seeing in San Francisco, and what that's like, because I know that 40% now of public bus routes have been closed, and there are drivers who are advocating for more closures. It seems like the city is on lockdown for the foreseeable. Last time we talked, you mentioned that there were certain things that the city is doing. What more could the city be doing? What are you seeing now?
In San Francisco, I frankly see us being very fortunate. The city is effectively on lockdown, but so is the rest of the United States and frankly the whole world. I've rarely been more grateful to live here than I have in the last few weeks, particularly because our local officials were among the first in the country to declare shelter at home orders. And it really has depressed the infection and the fatality rates here in San Francisco, which are remarkably low relative to many other cities. And I'm very grateful to our city's leadership for that. There have been missed opportunities, and I'm grateful also to see the city's leadership learn from them. Our unhoused population is substantial. Thousands of San Franciscans live without shelter, and they are at particular risk of contracting the disease and passing it. So as contagion vectors, our unhoused population, not just for their own sake, but for everyone's sake, needs to be cared for. And so the mayor at one point had announced plans to get emergency housing, unfortunately, in a congregant setting, which of course violates every known public health guidance. So there was a campaign, very assertive, people in a car blockade mobilized in a protest around City Hall recently. I think it was 2 days ago. And the mayor thankfully relented and has used her emergency powers that the Board of Supervisors approved to place our unhoused population in hotel rooms for the moment. And there's plenty of empty hotel rooms in the city because there's no travel anywhere in the United States. And so this is really a win-win both for the industry. It's a win-win for the unhoused population who need to have shelter, especially at a time like this. And it's particularly a victory for public health, recognizing this shared interest in making sure that everybody has shelter and access to the care and services that they need. More things that the city could do. I'm very grateful, particularly to the visionary leadership of a democratic socialist who represents the district I live in, D5, on our board of supervisors. His name is Dean Preston, and Dean has been advocating for, in addition to the emergency shelter, among other things, a rent and mortgage freeze and forgiveness. And this idea of not only suspending the payments of mortgages and rents, as our Governor Newsom has done across the state, but forgiving those payments until the pandemic is at least in a different place and people can go back to work. It's a distributed question. Who bears the cost of the pandemic? Will it be banks and landlords, or will it be people who are living paycheck to paycheck? And at the moment, the market defaults to risk moving downhill. And so the most vulnerable people in our society are the ones taking it on the chin. And, the idea of a suspension of payments being due is welcome, just like a $1,200 cash payment from Congress is welcome. It's not enough by a long shot. One-time payment doesn't get us there, just like a suspension of payments while the responsibility to pay ultimately continues to accrue. Those arrears will become substantial, and people are going to be, in May and June, in likely no easier a place to make whole those obligations. And so this is a really important place for local and state, and particularly federal leaders to step in. I'm grateful for some of the expansions at the federal level in the support. Maybe we can talk about that separately, but there's a similar dynamic here where we've seen nods to needs and expansions, for instance, of unemployment benefits to include gig workers and students for the first time. But it's not enough by a long shot when we're talking about $1,200 one-time cash payments to families at a time when people can't work for months at a time. And in these distributive questions, from whose hide are we carving out the costs of this pandemic? The idea that it's going to be we, the people of the United States, who are already suffering from, our friends and neighbors and loved ones, passing in the face of the virus itself, to, I think a lot of people are going through very profound experiences in isolation. And I think that this is a really bad time for workers and working families to be forced to pay the cost of our civilizational challenges.
So let me ask you, do you think Nancy Pelosi has done, no, you obviously don't, but can you tell me some of the ways that you feel that Nancy Pelosi has not done enough to deal with this crisis?
I do want to give her credit where it's due in terms of having expanded particularly benefits to include gig workers and students, but there's so many places where she's just entirely abandoned the need to defend the needs of the American people. Principally, I would think about paid sick leave here. So thankfully, in one of the stimulus bills responding to the coronavirus, I think it was the second among them, there was an expansion of paid sick leave benefits. But the carve-outs were so expansive, both for businesses large and small, that it only covered 20% of the workforce. Why are 80% of Americans not allowed to stay home if they're sick, especially when the CDC is saying, hey, everybody, stay home, even if you're not sick, right? I mean, not giving paid sick leave is just forcing working people to take it on the chin. And why are working people bearing the cost of the pandemic, right? It shouldn't be the people most vulnerable who could be on the street if not for a paycheck. Most Americans can't muster $400 on, if they need it in an emergency situation. And we are the people who are supposed to pay for this. And I can understand why Nancy Pelosi might not appreciate that. I mean, she is a wealthy landlord who makes $1 million a year from rent alone.
Just want to say, if Nancy Pelosi, not that she would, but if she ever wanted to come on this channel and talk, the offer is open. But please continue.
Thank you. Well, just as I remain very eager to debate her, but she hasn't debated an opponent in 30 years. And I don't see that changing. I'd love to. I'll make that same invitation. If anybody wants to actually defend her record in public, I'm all for it. And I think that, the residents of San Francisco would be enriched by it too. As an immigrant, there are a lot of things I don't take for granted that I think many Americans do. And the idea that when you run for public office, you're supposed to show up for a debate is one of them.
I mean, that's pretty shocking. I think a lot of people will find that shocking, maybe outside of San Francisco, but the idea that an incumbent wouldn't face a challenger in a debate, especially a general election challenger in a debate. So let's talk about that.
Like, it's bad enough in one cycle, but to do that for a generation, it attains an even different character of
So you're up against somebody, a 17-term incumbent.
Yeah.
She has the backing of, obviously, she has the backing of California's Democratic establishment. She
Right.
is California's Democratic establishment.
She's the nation's Democratic
She's
establishment.
even got the backing of progressive activists like Addie Barkan. And on
Yeah.
top of that, the pandemic, uh, which shall go unnamed for the duration of this interview, um, has thrown an obstacle in your way. Can you tell me how your campaign is adapting to fight what is a huge uphill battle?
Yes, thank you for raising that. It did punch a hole in our plans in lots of different ways, particularly because most of the traditional campaign tactics that people pursue, knocking on doors, events, gatherings, mobilizations, we couldn't do any of that without putting people at risk. And so it really forced the campaign to pivot and shift. On the one hand, not only could we not use those traditional campaign tactics, but it also, frankly, people's minds are just elsewhere. There are more existential problems I think that people are grappling with at the moment. So for the last month, what we've been doing is calling first our 1,000 volunteers and then San Francisco voters generally, just to share information about where they can get a free meal, how they can qualify for benefits, checking on people to make sure that they are okay, that they have access to the services that they need, that they know about the various networks from which they can request grocery delivery. There's a whole range of ways in which I think we've discovered people needing support, and we're not, as a campaign, so set up to deliver services, but we are very set up to deliver information, and so we've been doing that. We made well over 1,000 calls in the last few weeks, just these wellness checks and information sharing opportunities. And it's been interesting to hear from people about particularly the way people have been feeling isolated and appreciating hearing from someone and connecting just around and having a chance to talk about whatever their various needs and concerns are. We're soon going to be shifting from that back to voter outreach. And in fact, we're currently testing and plan to launch in the next week distributed phone banking so that anyone, anywhere, can call San Francisco voters on behalf of our campaign. And this was a key strategy for the Bernie campaign in 2016 and 2020. And having put dozens of hours myself on the Bernie dialer, I would just say that we have been, as a movement, fighting to flip entire states, and many of them, obviously. We have 7 months to just flip one city. Like, this is absolutely doable. And setting up the infrastructure to enable that, we have a freakishly wide national base, I think largely because Nancy Pelosi has been so instrumental in cementing bipartisan corporate rule and deferring to authoritarianism and sacrificing executive accountability and ultimately gatekeeping on the right to prevent the progressive left's aspirations from finding representation in policy. I think for that reason, we have a freakishly wide national base, and we're very eager to invite folks to be a part of the campaign and to make it theirs. And that'll be happening just in the next week. Opportunities like this, I spent a lot of time on live streams, and a lot more certainly than I was doing before. And so taking advantage of the time when we are all online and off the street, as someone who spent a lot of time on the street, being online for the moment is sort of where the action is at, as it were. And that's been an opportunity, responding to the needs of the moment. I've had a few opportunities to roll up my sleeves and get on the street to deliver groceries with the food bank. We had a stash of particulate masks that we got for the wildfire season last year that we donated to a local charity that serves people at risk in the Tenderloin, a particularly challenged neighborhood here in San Francisco. Those are a few of the ways that we've pivoted. And I'm looking forward to the future. I think the pandemic creates real obvious risks for all of us. Again, I feel really fortunate here in San Francisco. I know for you all in New York, my heart just breaks every day that I read the news, and it's
Sirens are bad. My fiance and I've been quarantined in the apartment for the last 3+ weeks. But every day there's a lot of sirens, and there's one now. It's actually probably the thing that will define this in my memory is my fiance listening for sirens and noting when they happen, and yeah. So I appreciate that. Obviously, we have not been personally impacted by the coronavirus.
I'm so glad to hear that. And your loved ones are doing okay?
My grandmother may have it, actually, that I say that, but But I think, I talked to a friend of mine who's a nurse who said that when the people go down, they go down fairly quickly, and so I think she's doing all right. It's been a couple weeks now, so I'm much less concerned. When it first happened, I was a wreck, but now I'm all right. Um, so I wanted to ask now, you're running as a progressive. You're the only candidate in the race who supports Medicare for all. Do you think that this pandemic um, makes your case easier? Or, I mean, obviously it makes campaigning harder, but do you think it makes the case that you're trying to make easier?
Absolutely, and you nailed it. It's exactly that distinction. It tactically makes the work of campaigning more difficult, but the pandemic makes inescapably clear the case for treating healthcare as a human right. It makes the case more strongly than I can. It makes the case more strongly even than Bernie Sanders ever has. We can't treat healthcare like a commodity. It's senseless. It doesn't just place at risk the health of the people who can't afford to see a doctor. It doesn't just place at risk the health of people in between jobs who can't get access to employer insurance. It doesn't just place at risk the family members of those people. It places at risk public health. And contagion dials up the extent to which that's true, right? Contagion makes obvious the externality that makes public health a public good. That's in the language of economists, so they can understand. But like, there's no pretense, there's no plausible case that healthcare should be a commodity. And before it might have just been vicious, but the pandemic makes it stupid too. And I'm eager for us not to make stupid public policy decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, like, that we face things like a testing shortage. So I had a friend out in my hometown who I had contact with who had symptoms of coronavirus. I think but it couldn't get tested because we don't have. They were reserving tests for a very specific subset of people. It's shocking that we're facing hospital shortages. We're facing people with this illness that are not going to the doctor. People will die from that. It does seem like the case against Medicare for all just got really, really hard, and the case for very lax trade agreements, I think, also got much harder to make.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have domestic supply chains for things like ventilators. We normalized trade relations with China, and now they are the leading manufacturer of ventilators in the world. And so when a pandemic hits China first, how are we supposed to stockpile? Now, we did talk last time about how or I asked you last time how you think we should balance trade with preparedness. And
Right.
I was hoping that you could get into that a little bit
Yeah.
with the remaining time that we have.
Thank you. A big piece of that is respecting organized labor. The erosion of organized labor in the United States came from the very same forces, corporate globalization, driving international trade. And just on this point, with respect to the speaker, it's very telling that on the very same day that the House impeached the president, Nancy Pelosi was whipping votes for Trump's latest corporate trade agreement. Corporate trade agreements inherently undermine nation state sovereignty. They place countries' decisions to guard their environment and the health of the safety of their workers and consumers behind the interests of international companies. And that's inherently problematic, whatever the safeguards in any particular deal might be. And when we saw this erosion of domestic manufacturing capacity in the 90s, what accompanied it was sort of, the latest among the stakes through the heart of labor, organized labor in the United States. I'm dedicated to supporting organized labor, and I think restoring domestic manufacturing capacity not only would better guard public health by increasing our resiliency in the face of events like this, but it would also support organized labor and create likely thousands, hundreds of thousands, who knows, millions of jobs, which we're going to need given the way that unemployment is spiking. I think the failures of corporate capitalism and the international trade-based system were laid bare in 2008. We did not learn the lesson, and we are being invited to learn it again. There are lots of opportunities we have to learn lessons that we ignore before. This brings to mind another set, and it is a wild digression from where we're at, so I don't want to pursue it unless it's okay with you, but there are lots of examples of us unheeding warnings and burying our heads in the sand and then paying profound prices for it later.
Climate change, I think, is the obvious
Exactly.
direction that this would go.
And it connects to the pandemic like this. Habitat
Mm-hmm.
destruction drives increasing interspecies contact, which, if this was a zoonic disorder, the habitat destruction for endangered species and other wildlife can increase the risks of these kinds of contagion. It's not directly related to fossil fuel extraction in the way that climate chaos is, but in terms of corporate resource extraction, it is absolutely related. It is corporate resource extraction driving climate change. It is corporate resource extraction driving habitat destruction. In both dimensions, we are paying profound costs for putting corporate interests before the needs of communities in the future.
And you've already seen that we're trying to deregulate, the environment now. So it does to deal with the economic fallout from this current crisis. So we'll take, it's sort of a loan on the future, right? It will eventually come due.
That's all we do is take loans from the future and force it to pay for our refusal to heed science and reason in the present.
Well, Shahid, thank you very much for doing this with me. I want to give you a few minutes. I know that you have other interviews coming up. Tell everyone where they can find you, how they can sign up, and.
Right on. Thank you, Walker. It's great to be with you. So you can join us online at shahidforchange.us. We're also on each of the major social networking platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Shahid for Change. In just a few minutes, I think in the next hour, we'll be broadcast on C-SPAN with the Commonwealth Club. I'll be in conversation with some journalists there. And I would invite any of your listeners to join our campaign. We're going to need to liberate the 12th Congressional District seat to breathe life into the new future before the present kills it. Thanks for having me on. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Shahid. Take care.
Peace, brother.